I'd like to introduce Brad Blunt. Brad and I are going to tag team a little bit here. Like I said, we've met twice now to discuss what Brad is going through, and Brad's going through a lot, and his parents are going through a lot, and I taught their daughter. I know them. They're wonderful people. Nobody can comprehend that pain unless they've been through it, both Brad's pain and his parents' pain. And I'm just thrilled that they are willing to be here tonight and share this story. Some of you may know Brad, football player, Vestavia Hills High School, graduated in 2009, wrestler, baseball player. The main reason Brad's here tonight is to put a face on this problem. Brad does not look like the face that we think of when we see on TV what's going on with drug use. Brad looks like a strapping Vestavia football player, wrestler, baseball player, but Brad is fighting addiction, and he's fighting it hard. And he and I, as we've spoken, he said, you know, I'm a long way from being done with this. This is a daily battle, and I just have to fight the good fight every day. Again, I'm very proud of him, and I know his parents are proud of him also. But I'm going to fire off a few questions for Brad, and I'm going to help him through these because I'm nervous, he's nervous, so we'll make it through together. Brad, in some of the stories that we've talked about, you mentioned how you had to deal with your parents. And my first question to you is, what was the gut feeling of your parents, and how did you kind of beat back their suspicions?
Well, in the beginning, I had an injury, so I was prescribed pain medicine. So at the early stages of my addiction, my parents had really no suspicion of me being on, any kind of trouble of addiction for opiate-based pain medication. Yes, they did not condone drinking. They, might have caught me drinking a couple times, and they definitely didn't condone marijuana use. We're trying to focus on opiate use tonight. So definitely in the beginning, my parents really had no idea that this was going on with me, and neither did I. It definitely sneaks up on you quick, and it's a long road that eventually ends, in the dirty word of heroin. But for me and my parents, as time went on, and I continued to fight this, whether I knew it or not, my understanding grew more and more of it, and they started to get suspicious. They would ask me questions about it, are you, might have taken too much of this, or, whatever it may be. But I can promise you I became an Academy Award winner actor when it comes to protecting this. No matter what it took, there was no boundaries anymore. There was no morals. It all came down to, how can I make them believe that I'm okay? Whether it started out as just fear of getting caught, and I knew at this point what I was doing was so terrible, but I would do anything to make sure that they would have no clue that their son was doing, the unspeakable, fighting addiction with opiate-based pain medication.
Brad, you remember, Brad mentioned a story to me where his parents had drug tested him, and he tested positive. I wanted him to touch a little bit on that Academy Award-winning performance. Mom had him dead to rights, and one thing that we discussed is when you love someone, you want to believe them. You really don't want to think that the unthinkable is happening. And I wanted Brad to touch a little bit on, the manipulation part of that. Mom comes downstairs, she's upset, she's in tears, you've tested positive. How did you do it?
Yeah, as the suspicion rose, my parents did what they thought was right and started drug testing me, of course. That's what I'm sure most parents would think, well, I'm going to find out what's going on. So when my mom comes down crying, first thing I'm thinking is, how am I getting out of this? It's not, let's tell the truth and let's do the right thing. Let's, face this. Of course, it's like, what can I do to get out of this? And like, Mr. Howard said, your parents want to believe you. You know that as a kid. I mean, this sounds really messed up, but I mean, you are a master manipulator at this point because you want to do anything not to get in trouble. You want to do anything to basically continue what you've been doing this whole time. So I would tell her anything, swear up and down, tell her, this had to happen from something slipped in my drink. I was at a party. I don't know who these people were. This anything but me. I'm not the problem. It's someone else. So I would say, like I said before, just really anything. And I mean, it didn't happen just like that. I mean, my mom was, pretty on me at this point, but that just shows you how strong of a conviction you can have to speak and to try to lie your way out of anything when you're this far deep into it.
Brad, can you tell the audience a little bit about the conditions, things that had happened to you when you first took these pain medications and how it made you feel?
This is something, that I have like a pretty deep connection with because this is basically how it all started for me. Most of you in this room won't understand what I'm talking about, the feeling that I'm talking about, and I hope you never do. Absolutely. So when I had this injury, I was a 3-sport athlete at Vestavia, thought I had everything figured out. I was going to go play college baseball. I didn't really care about grades at this point. All I wanted to do was, go play sports. That's who I was. That's everything I knew. I never had any off time. It was just, sports and school, sports and school. And when I had a shoulder injury, and that was, I got a call from my doctor, my surgeon, said the MRI came back, said, everything in your shoulder's torn. You're not going to, we can try. I mean, and we were all about trying, but you're definitely not playing football, baseball, or wrestling for your senior year, and you're probably, you might not be ever be able to pitch again. So, like, for me, like, that was my identity. That was who I was. I was a baseball player. I was an athlete. That's all I knew of myself at this time, being 17. And that was all stripped away from me in a blink of an eye. I had nothing left. I was depressed. I was crying. I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know what to do with anything. My shoulder was, in a lot of pain. I was in a lot of pain emotionally and physically. And I didn't know how to deal with these type of situations at all. And I took Olortab for the pain. I had never taken any pain medicine before in my life. I had never taken pills before in my life. And when I took that 5 milligram Lortab, it was like, the best way to describe it was like a light bulb switched on in my head, and I was like, this is it. This is like the answer to your problems. I was no longer depressed. I was no longer unhappy. Everything was going to be fine. Baseball was going to work out. Surgery was going to work out. School was going to work out. Everything was going to work out. I felt smarter. I felt better. I didn't have pain. I mean, everything was just perfect. And little did I know, that was what started the long road to pretty much be the end of, my life for that part.
Brad expressed to me, I asked him a question, how long could you go, without having to take something? And I was very surprised at his answer. I'd like for him to touch a little bit on that. How long?
For me, at first, it's different. I mean, like I said, I speak of this like it's a long road because it is. It never starts, hard. It always starts slowly and progressively. I mean, at the end, I had a clock in my head that was, every 4 hours. If I did not have any medicine, then I knew I was going to feel terrible. I knew I wasn't going to be able to do anything. I knew I couldn't see my family. I knew I couldn't see my girlfriend. I knew I couldn't see my friends because they would think I was sick or something. Something would be up. And, I was so desperate to protect my image, my addiction, everything, anything to keep doing what I was doing. So, yeah, it's about every 4 hours I knew that I would have to have something. I know we touched on the family vacations. And, that's something you think you would look forward to. You want to go on a family vacation with your family. I'm going to the beach, or I'm going snowboarding with my family. That's something people get excited about. Not me. I was be so anxious about going on a family vacation because I was scared I would get sick while I was there. And that's the worst fear. It sounds crazy, but you're so terrified of that feeling. You're so terrified of that happening that you will do, anything. You'll say you're not going to go, like don't want to go when you know you want to go, but it's just not going to be possible for you.
I've spoken with many parents that their children need pain medication. They've had surgery, they've had dry socket from wisdom teeth, and they need something. What would you say to parents that are facing that problem? Like, do I give them this? Do I not?
I think that's really important because, like you said, opiate pain medicine can either be the devil or an angel. I'm not here saying that all opiate, pain medicine use is bad, because it doesn't always end like that. It really doesn't. For some people, it does. But for advice to parents, if your kid is prescribed, or if you are prescribed pain medicine, if at all possible, don't take it. Just don't take it. There's no point in taking it if Advil will do or Aleve will do. That's something I'll have to do, the rest of my life. No matter pretty much what happens, I'm always going to say I don't want it. And if you can do that, you just never know. You don't know how you're going to react to it. Some people, it's proven that they have a genetic disposition to feel better through opiates. Like you said before, some people feel irritated when they take pain medicine. I wish I felt that way when I took it. Some people don't, and you just don't know how you're going to feel. You don't know how long you're going to be taking it. All those factors come into play. If at all possible, don't take it. If you have to take it, or if your kid has to take it, either if it's your child, make sure you are in control of that medicine. Don't give I would argue with my family, I'm an adult. I'm almost 18 years old. I could go fight in the military for our country. You're not an adult. No, you're not. No, you're not. So no, don't give them control over if they're going to take this narcotic. It's a drug. You can get high off this. That's like saying you can use marijuana when you want to. Just don't let them control it. Be in control. Use it as directed. And if not needed, if the pain is not bad, then don't take it.
Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Dale Wisely. We appreciate him being here very much. And he is the Director of Student Services and Community Education at Mountain Brook Schools. He's been a child and adolescent clinical psychologist for over 30 years, and he brings a lot of educational experience. He got his clinical psychology PhD and MS degree from the University of Memphis. He served a clinical internship in psychology at West Virginia University School of Medicine, and he holds a master's in theological studies from Spring Hill College. He has taught and held some adjunct faculty positions at UAB, at the University of Alabama, and Spring Hill College. And he's also the past president of the Alabama Psychological Association, and he's received several distinguished service awards in that capacity. He is a regular and popular adult speaker on parenting and family issues such as what we're talking about here this evening. And I appreciate him coming, and it's an honor and privilege to have you speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Really wasn't nervous till I got here and saw the crowd. It's People standing in the back, 2 or 3 TV stations. I think I spotted Wolf Blitzer loitering outside. So. Congratulations for having this number of people in our community. I live in Vestavia Hills, and so I'm proud to see this, as I know you are. We have been fighting this battle for a long time in the Mountain Brook School District where I work, and sometimes we struggle to get people to come out. This is very encouraging. I hope you'll continue. The only thing that we really know that gives us the best shot at trying to combat these problems is a broad-based community effort that's sustained over time. You have to keep it up. You have to keep going. And from time to time, if you do have low numbers, you keep going. I always tell people when you, unlike tonight, when you do have smaller crowds, you have to think about everybody being kind of deputized, you know, to go out and spread the word to their friends. And so it's a very encouraging thing to have so many people here. I want to focus on my personal interest in all this and professional interest, which is to talk about the prevention piece and the response piece. What can we do at the level of the family? If you're like things are at Mountain Brook, sometimes we have a tendency in the community to say, what's school going to do? What's somebody else going to do about this? And again, a community effort means everybody plays a part. The schools will always play an important part, as they do in my school district. But we also believe very much in empowering parents to do what they can just to be aware. Let me say a couple things to start. And I chose this little diagram, this picture on purpose. It's impossible to think when you're raising kids at this age that you could be facing this thing down the road. We think about that a lot in Mountain Brook and elsewhere. We have numbers in Mountain Brook. By the time our high school students leave us, 75% or so will tell us on anonymous surveys that they're drinking. 50% will describe themselves as regular drinkers. And when you walk into a classroom, as I did today, and you look at first graders, it's hard to imagine 3/4 of them will be drinkers and half of them will be pretty significant drinkers by the time they leave us. It's impossible to think that way. It's very difficult. So we have to keep this focus, and we have to remember this is the time to start talking about it, to start looking for opportunities. And Lord knows there's an abundance of opportunities to raise this question. We had one last week with the tragic death of a very public figure, Robin Williams. We have celebrities who are in trouble all the time. So there's endless opportunities to talk to our kids about it. A tip for you after 32 years of being a family psychologist. By the way, I just came back this weekend from my 40th high school reunion. I'm still a little weirded out by that. My friend Dickie Barlow, my boss, the superintendent over at Mount Brook, said I needed to be prepared to walk into a room full of old people, and that's exactly what happened. Somehow I just didn't imagine that would happen. But a little tip about, just a very practical tip about talking to your kids about sensitive things like drugs and alcohol. Probably the worst way to do that for most of us is to sit down one Tuesday night at the dining room table, have the talk. A couple problems with that. If you've ever tried it that way, you know the kind of reaction you get. You get a lot of eye rolling, you get a lot of discounting. You're trying to cram a lot of information in a short time. It's overwhelming for people. And there's all that, as a friend of mine said, all that creepy eye contact. So an alternate way to do that, and I'm really not kidding, is in my sort of private vocabulary, I refer to as talking about it on the way to Target. Get your kid in the car with you and ride off to Target or someplace, doesn't matter where, ride someplace. You've eliminated the creepy eye factor, eye contact factor, and just sometimes conversations flow better in that kind of context. So look for opportunities, plenty of them, and don't rely on the talk. It's kind of like sex education talks. Try to jam all that in one evening with a 14-year-old, they'll totally freak out for good reason, start running away from you. Talk about the things that kill our teenagers. I'm interested, I spent 15 years working at Children's Hospital, learning the psychology department. And for most of my career, my office was literally next door to the old emergency department. So that's how I got interested in things that kill teenagers. So let's look at the list. This is in Alabama. This is for ages 15 to 24. Top causes of death, more or less in order. And by far the first is motor vehicle accidents. I have an interest in that. I do talks. I do talks every year here at your Board of Education on teen driving. I do it 3 or 4 times in Mountain Brook and travel around doing it. Motor vehicle accidents by far is the #1 killer of teenagers by far. Depending on the neighborhood, quite literally true, number 2 will either be suicide or homicide. Suicide among young people is the second cause of death, certainly in affluent and mostly white neighborhoods. Homicide is the #2 cause of death in African American poor communities of various kinds. So those kind of play tag team for number 2 and 3. And then we have unintentional poisoning. And the majority of unintentional poisoning cases are the accidental ingestion of drugs, the very kind of thing we've been talking about tonight with opiates and opioids. Not all, but most of those poisonings are related to drug use. And then the 5th cause are all the other accidents, things like drownings and so forth. So if you looked at the direct impact, the direct drug use as the direct cause of death, it's not that highly ranked. But then I ask you to look at that list and tell me how many of those things that kill teenagers are very much influenced by alcohol and drugs. How many of them? All of them. Motor vehicle accidents, obviously a great complication and driving force, no pun intended, where those accidents is alcohol and drugs. Suicide. Suicide has contributions from substance abuse, not always, but very often in a couple of ways. One is that people are often under the direct influence of substances, maybe just alcohol, maybe something else, when they attempt suicide or in fact die by suicide. And another way suicide is impacted by drug abuse is that over time, when someone is an addict, and particularly if they're unable to beat that addiction, it increases their risk of suicide as they go through that process. The law enforcement people in the room can tell you that there's a very close connection between substance abuse and homicide. And there are many other kinds of things we could talk about in that context. I've already mentioned poisoning. Other accidents like people drowning at the lake, sort of recreational drownings and falls and things, are greatly influenced by substance abuse. So all that is a long way of saying I think you can make the case that directly or indirectly, alcohol and drugs are the #1 killer of our youth. If you're going to lose someone, as you have, and as we have in our community, in a given year, the most likely reason is going to be directly or indirectly substance abuse. I believe that's fair to say. Also want to say that, before I go further with this, that we'll talk about this again. It's already been mentioned. No one is immune. No one is immune. And I think later I'll talk about a couple of examples, including one we've already heard, about how the kind of folks we normally think of as just good and solid and decent people can end up in really serious trouble with drug addiction. I also want to say something about the role, at the beginning, of the role of mental health disorders. It's very well known among clinicians, I think well known among law enforcement folks, that there's very often a connection between substance abuse and psychiatric problems. And I think, again, the Robin Williams story is a great example of that from what I know from the press. And I'll just mention one thing. Of all the things that were said and written last week about that particular tragedy, there's one that has stuck with me. I just ran across it randomly, I think in social media someplace. And that was somebody who said that when someone dies by suicide or they die from an addiction, that we often use the language of losing. They lost their battle. They lost their battle with depression. They lost their battle with substance abuse or with addiction. And this person said, these people are not losers. They're just terrible diseases. Terrible diseases that none of us, again, is immune to. Let's talk about an incomplete list of some of the drugs we're always worried about, and I am going to talk about alcohol. I'm going to talk about it a good bit, actually, in a moment, that's always there, and just as likely as any of these drugs to take out one of your teenagers this academic year. There is no comfort for a parent that should be taken in saying it's just alcohol. Alcohol kills people deader than anything. Kills teenagers in large numbers, kills adults in large numbers. And we'll cover that in a little bit. Marijuana is always out there. Prescription medication, I'm so glad we've had some focus on that. I'm going to skip the part about opiates and painkillers, except for one quick story in a minute. But the others that we often see trouble with are the stimulant medications that are often prescribed for ADHD. And let me quickly add, as somebody who's taken care of many, many children with ADHD in my career as a psychologist, that the irony of that is people who actually have ADHD don't often abuse their medication or don't become addicted to their medication. Typically, the people who abuse stimulant medications are people who do not have ADHD. Anti-anxiety medications like Xanax and Klonopin are widely abused, and of course, prescription pain medicines. I'm going to tell an embarrassing story about myself in the service of maybe being helpful to you. It really is embarrassing. Should have known better. Some years ago, I don't know how long it's been, we raised 3 daughters. And some years ago, I just went about the business of cleaning out a medicine cabinet. You know how you do that occasionally. And realized that over several years, we had accumulated, I had about 90 Lortabs on hand in my house. I just didn't realize it. The usual kind of thing, somebody go to the emergency room and get it prescribed Lortabs and maybe take one or maybe not take any and put it in the medicine cabinet and not even think about it again. And then somebody got a dry socket. There's another, so I was profoundly embarrassed, especially when you think about all the kids who had been through my house to spend the night, right? So they're up in the medicine cabinet someplace, and somebody spends the night at your house, and they get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, go in, pop the medicine cabinet, take a quick scan of what's in there, and take out whatever they want, and probably wouldn't, I don't know that I would have missed it. And again, I'm not proud of that story. I'm kind of embarrassed. But I want to tell that story as a reminder that we have to be more mindful of how we deal with these things in our homes. All of us do. Lots of interest right now in these sort of bizarre synthetic marijuana things, spice and bath salts. Basically, stuff that's until fairly recently, what was it, 2011 or something, were not regulated, were not illegal. Leafy materials soaked with all kinds of weird chemicals. The biggest problem with those being people just never know what they're getting. It's not a particular uniform active drug that's in all of those. It's a big mixture of very strange things. And so I think to this day they're fairly poorly understood. But there's certainly multiple cases of people dying as a result of ingesting those things. And then, of course, I would mention heroin. I think this has also been, I will admit, quite a revelation for me. There's been lots of talk in the last several years about heroin over the mountain. And I think I have to admit that probably until fairly recently, kind of in the back of my mind, if I knew somebody was involved in heroin, I tended to think of sort of a career recreational drug user, just somebody who just kind of thrown everything away a long time ago, and at some point they just say, hey, gee, I think I'll try heroin today, and you kind of wonder why in the world they'd do that. I think we all know now there's a very different story behind heroin. It's often the story of, as it was used as the name of a recent program at UAB about this, pills to needles, all right? An addiction to a narcotic that progresses to the point that it actually may be cheaper to use heroin. It may be easier to get it because you've kind of run out of resources in terms of talking to the medical doctors and so forth. And so there's a progression to heroin that's particularly scary. And of course, once people are there, it's very difficult to turn back. When Philip Seymour Hoffman died, I remember hearing several experts commenting that once somebody's involved in IV narcotics, they're just not going to survive to be middle-aged. I want to just challenge you about this one. Is alcohol the worst drug on the planet? And everybody in the room wants to say no, and I understand that. And of course, like all other questions, it depends on how you ask the question. There's a way you can ask this question or think about the answer to this question where I think the answer may be yes. Are there drugs that we could go out tonight after the meeting and do that would be more dangerous than alcohol? Maybe. Sure. I think we can all think of things like that. If the question though means if you kind of back up and you look at the big picture and you look at the whole planet and you ask yourself what drug that people abuse causes the most misery and pain and destruction to the most people, I think it's probably alcohol. The only contender for that might be tobacco, by the way, which kills about 6 million people a year and is responsible for maybe 1 out of 10 deaths. It's the ultimate irony that somehow we've ended up with the maybe two biggest killers being the two that are legal. It's the oddest thing when you think about it. I often challenge people along this way. If we never had alcohol, let's say alcohol didn't exist. And of course, it always has because it exists by, fermentation of carbohydrates. So if we didn't have alcohol, and in 2014 it got invented in some lab in Mexico and got released on the street, and people started noticing how rapidly it works, how quickly it gets in your bloodstream, and quickly start to notice how much it contributes to child abuse and domestic violence and motor vehicle accidents and lost productivity and yada, yada. There's no way it'd be legal. Absolutely no way. If it was invented as a new drug, exactly as it is now in 2014, I guarantee it'd be illegal. So it's just an accident of history and biology and that we ended up with alcohol, which destroys a lot of lives. Next. It's a major or direct contributor, certainly contributing factor in the death of lots and lots of kids, lots of injuries. About 5,000 people a year, young people a year, die as a result of underage drinking. Next. Thank you. Binge drinking. This is usually defined in terms of about 5 drinks in one sitting on one occasion. And the really scary thing about young drinkers, underage drinking, this is also true of college drinking, by the way, is when a young person identifies themselves as a drinker, they're almost always a binge drinker. Binge drinking is just a part of underage drinking. The idea of a teenager who just will occasionally have a beer at a party or something is really fairly uncommon. Binge drinking is the norm among young people. And of course, binge drinking is what's acutely deadly about alcohol. And so a long way of saying that it's not a way we can take comfort in knowing our kids are just abusing alcohol and not abusing other drugs. A couple of other things to consider about alcohol is the impact it has on adolescent brain development. Later this year, I'm going to do a talk on misunderstanding the teenage brain, which is a whole other topic. But we now know, of course, that the brain is developing much later than we used to think. It's probably not into the mid-20s before the brain stops cooking. And during the time it's in development, it's particularly sensitive to introduction of any number of chemicals and drugs, including probably marijuana and absolutely alcohol. So from a health point of view, there's simply no question that the best approach for parents to support is a no alcohol approach for their young people with developing brains, and we'll say more about that a little bit later. And by the way, if it's true that the brain's not fully developed until the mid-20s, this has implications for young adults. And even in the legal college age type drinking beyond 21, there are brain implications for that simply aren't the same as they would be for people my age or the age of many people in this room. So didn't mean to be presumptuous, but some of you look like you're in my cohort, so to speak. Next. 5 things that parents believe that are just flat wrong. And I want to go through these with you as, again, a way to just kind of challenge your thinking about this. First one is, I'm going to supervise their drinking. I'm going to take their keys and let them drink in a safe environment. And by the way, we have an expression we use in Mountain Brook. I think I coined this phrase, and that is the lake effect. I borrowed the term from meteorology, right? It has nothing to do with the weather. The lake effect is parents who, when they're in Vestavia Hills, working their jobs and just, you know, the usual kind of week, same in Mountain Brook, they might have really good sense and really good practices about watching their kids and monitoring their kids. Then they go off to the lake or go off to the beach or go off to the ski resort, and all the rules kind of get loose. Oh, it's vacation time. Everybody just kind of relaxes, and the kids kind of have more run of things and, you know, go over to this beach house or this lake house for a little party and this and that. You don't quite know where your kids are the way you would when they're at home, and so that just leaves it open for all kinds of exploration and abuse that you don't really think about. The lake effect, we call that. So if you supervise your kids drinking, you decide, well, I want them to drink in my home so they'll be safe. So just a couple of things to consider. One thing is what message we're sending when we do that. One message is it's perfectly okay with me if you break the law. Laws are something to be disregarded, which I think is generally a pretty unhealthy message. Remember, each and every incident of a child drinking before 21 is illegal in all 50 states, and I'm not sure what message we convey when we allow our kids to, or supervise their drinking. I don't know what responsible teenage drinking looks like, to be honest, particularly when it's legal. I've never seen it, never seen responsible teenage drinking. And I think also importantly, the research is very clear that parental tolerance of underage drinking leads to more drinking and not less drinking. And I'll cover that again in just a minute because I think it's particularly important. Next. Sorry about the change in slides here. I popped this in from another presentation. Heard this one before. I love this one. Young people in Europe drink more responsibly because it's relaxed and there's permissive alcohol use in the context of family, and people have wine together, you know, dinner and everything. So it allows them to learn to drink responsibly at a younger age. Or you'll hear the flip side of that, which is our United States punitive approach to underage drinking, you know, makes it go undercover and it becomes forbidden fruit that encourages alcohol use. Let's look at some data next. Just quickly, this is kind of an international study of underage drinking among youth. And this is the heavy drinking in the past 30 days among youth in different countries. All the European countries, at least the ones I can pronounce and spell. And then the last one there is the United States. So the only country that was surveyed in this particular study that had less heavy drinking in the United States was Turkey. And I think every other, as you can see, some of the other European countries just tower over us in terms of the amount of teenage drinking. So this idea that it's a good idea to supervise and teach kids how to drink is not really supported by the research. And then here's another one. They're going to drink anyway, so since they're going to drink anyway, we'll do this. We'll let them enjoy beer at the lake. We'll do this. We'll supervise, take everybody's keys, whatever it is. And it's just not true. It's just not true. Now, your teenagers will tell you that everybody drinks at Vestavia High School. It's not true. We hear the same thing in Mount Brook, and we have too much. We have, by the time our kids leave us, we have more alcohol abuse at Mount Brook High School than we do at the state level or the national level. So we're very clear about our dirty laundry. But that does not translate into every student in the school drinking. So that's just kind of a fatalistic sort of myth. Everybody drinks, so we just got to deal with it. And I just think that's just flatly not true. Every survey says there's at least a substantial minority of kids, even among high school seniors, that stay away from alcohol. Next. You know, I drank in high school, and I turned out just fine. And my response to that is usually, oh, did you really? That's my first response. My second response to that, because I know some of these people who say that, and they didn't turn out all that well. And I'm actually licensed in the state of Alabama to say that as a psychologist. And the second thing is, only the people who are alive to say it, right? Only the people who are not in jail, other than people who haven't had their life just kind of deteriorate to some low point they can't get back from. So it's only people who can stand up straight in Mountain Brook, Alabama, and Vestavia that can say that they survived that. Nobody ever said that drinking when you're in high school means it's inevitable you're going to die from it. I never said that. It's about risk, about the risk, and the risks are really very high. Sure, people survive it, but we lose too many, one way or the other, who don't survive the experience. They need to practice drinking before they go to college. It just drives me crazy. We're not talking about learning to play the clarinet here. The idea that sort of practicing it early, I don't really know what people are talking about. Because again, the evidence would point to something pretty different from that. And that is, I think I'll say this again, but maybe 3 times is too many. Supervised drinking leads to more unsupervised drinking, not less. That's the take-home point on this whole idea of teaching them how to drink and letting them practice so they get really, really good at it before they go off to college. I've got a little bit of an attitude about this, you might have noticed. Okay. And then again, at least it's not drugs. Well, first of all, alcohol is a drug. I think culturally we don't want to say that, but from any sensible clinical perspective, what it does to a person, like causes them to be like intoxicated, it's addicting for a substantial number of people who try it. Not everybody, but a substantial number of people who try it. So certainly alcohol is a drug. It's just a more generally socially acceptable drug. And, you know, it's hard to name another drug, as I said earlier, that's done that much damage to this number of people, unless it's tobacco. That might be the only contender for it. It's often lethal in essentially a single episode. That's what alcohol intoxication, or alcohol poisoning, not intoxication. Alcohol poisoning, as you know, is often lethal. Shuts down the respiratory system. Person dies, very often from asphyxiation. Just a reminder, no one's immune, no family's immune. I have 3 daughters, I have 2 grandkids. I will not stand up here and conclude that we're out of the woods. I won't conclude that I'm out of the woods. I won't conclude that my wife's out of the woods. We don't get out of the woods when it comes to addiction. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you often get addiction following legitimate treatment of some problem, most commonly pain. And then the other way is you develop a psychiatric illness. We're not out of the woods on that, right? Major depression, people get anxiety disorders. Sometimes the treatment they get is inadequate. It's hard to access psychiatric treatment sometimes, or psychological treatment. And so people self-medicate. So you have this very interesting sort of circular relationship between mental health disorders. So that's one way that good people can kind of back into substance abuse, is by way of developing a mental health disorder. So what do we know? We know that there's no one thing or no group of things that parents can do that will guarantee this won't happen. I'd love to tell you, nobody knows. Nobody knows a pattern that you can follow at home in raising your kids and raise your family, guarantee they won't get in trouble. What we can talk about is what the research tells us about ways that families can reduce the risk. That's all we can really hope to do, is to reduce the risk and hope for a good outcome. So that's what some of the things I want to cover in the remaining time that we have. What does the research tell us? All right. Here we go, yeah. Kids, when teenagers get into the teenage years, there's a thing that always happens, which is and it's supposed to happen. If it doesn't happen, there's something wrong. And that is, the teenagers begin to shift their focus from being primarily on their parents and their families to being more and more interested in what's going on with their peers. This is not a big surprise. It's a very normal process. But sometimes parents, misinterpret that as meaning that once their teenagers become teenagers, the parents' influence on their lives is no longer important. And that's not true. Teenagers tell us in study after study that they want to know what their parents believe. They want to know what their parents think. They want to know what their parents' expectations are. They want clarity about that. And we owe that to them. We owe them that kind of clarity. Now, what would be wrong with saying this to a teenager, which, by the way, is what we said to all 3 of our daughters? Alcohol is illegal in the state of Alabama, honey. So our expectation as a family is that you won't drink because it's against the law and it's bad for your health, and we're in charge of it, and we made a decision that you may not drink not one drop until it's legal to do so. Where did we give up that ground? Exactly when did we give up that ground? Now, we added this when we said it to our daughters. We added this. We said, just because we declared this, we're not naive enough to think that means you won't drink. If you do, and we learn about it, we're going to deal with it. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to throw you in prison or in a rehab facility. It means that if it's a health problem, we're going to deal with the health problem. If you did it and there's no health problem, you just did it, we're going to deal with it as a disciplinary issue. But we're not going to turn our backs on it. We're not going to shrug and say kids will be kids. We're not going to shrug and say everybody in Vestavia Mountain Brook drinks when they're teenagers, because it's not true. And furthermore, even if it was true, we wouldn't care. Because my job is to raise my daughters and not to care what everybody else is doing. All right? I was just hoping not to get thrown out. That was really kind of a nice bonus to get. Thank you. All right, so what are some good practices if we're adults and we're trying to take care of this? One is to make our rules very clear, and I just modeled for you one way you might consider doing that. But the main thing is, don't shrug it off, have the conversations over and over again. When my daughters left the house, invariably, we'd turn them around by their shoulders and make eye contact with them, and just before we kissed them on the forehead or cheek, we'd say, no alcohol and drugs. And we went through a little list of things, we'd go through. And obviously get to the point they're rolling their eyes. That's not my problem. My problem is to make sure I consistently remind them of that message, that I haven't at some point decided they were old enough that I didn't have to say it anymore. One of them's 32, I pretty much quit saying it. I don't have any control over it anymore. Clear rules, and I really do believe the best approach parents can take on this, the safest approach, the one that's best supported by the research, is a no-use policy, including alcohol. I really believe it, and I've been looking at this stuff for a long, long time. Another is consistent consequences. It doesn't necessarily mean punishment. Could mean consultation with a professional. It could be any number of things, but not ignoring it. There's always going to be consequences to it if you learn about it. And then loving support. And I'll say this at the end, but it bears repeating. We've got good research now to tell us that the family environment that's most likely to discourage alcohol and drug use is one characterized by a combination of two things. Loving support. That's the sweet stuff. That's the looking at the child and talking about how special they are and how much you love them. That stuff is important. But it's got to be combined with clear rules and consequences and some consistency. Those two things together make for the most powerful family environment to stay away from this kind of stuff. What about parental patterns? This is a very familiar problem to me. I get accused with regularity. In Mountain Brook, Dr. Wise is going around saying parents shouldn't drink or shouldn't let their kids know they're drinking. Never said it once because I don't believe it. I do think that parents need to consider their substance use behavior and the messages they convey to kids. So, sticking with alcohol for a minute, let's do pills first. In a household where people take a lot of pills, maybe even perfectly legal prescribed pills, taking them as prescribed. When kids grow up in a culture where people quickly turn to pills and are uncomfortable, we have to believe that might have an impact. Switch to alcohol. When I say that I don't think it's about whether parents drink or not, it's about the pattern of drinking. It's really what I'm talking about. And I've usually illustrated it this way. Let's say that you come home from, let's say that you're preparing dinner, and while you're preparing dinner, there are kids moving around in the kitchen, and you got a glass of wine on the counter, and you occasionally sip from the glass of wine while you're stir frying or whatever. I have no reason to think that's a bad idea. That's up to you and your family's decision making. Got no evidence that that kind of responsible use of alcohol is a problem for kids to see. How about, on the other hand, somebody comes home from work and they walk through the front door kind of fussing about the job and how awful things are, nobody understands them, nobody else will pull their weight at the office, and the first thing the parent does is make a beeline for the bar, pours a big one, drinks it, slumps down in the lazy boy and goes, that's a very different message. You got two different ways of a single drink with very different messages and what people convey. Another challenge I like to offer, this usually goes over like a lead balloon in Mountain Brook, is how often do you have a social event at your home with adults where there's no alcohol? And in Mountain Brook, I don't know about you guys, in Mountain Brook that didn't happen much. And it's unthinkable to watch a football game without a constant flow of alcohol or have any kind of social event. I think the adult cultural attitudes have a big impact on all this. 2011 study, adult supervised alcohol use among youth resulted in higher levels of harmful alcohol consequences among youth. Next, think about the pattern. What is the message you're trying to convey? Or maybe not trying to convey, but you are conveying with your patterns of use in the home. Another one I get a lot is, how do you handle the dreaded question? You know what the dreaded question is? Mom, did you drink in high school? Dad, did you smoke pot in high school? And for those of you who did, careful choice of pronoun there, that could be a hard one to know how to respond to. And so just a couple of tips. What are your options? Let's say you did. Let's say you drank. Let's say you drank a lot in high school. Let's say you did drugs in high school. There's a couple things you could do. You could lie, of course. You could say, nope, no, I didn't. And then, when your brother Larry visits from Denver, you're busted, right? So that may not be the approach. Now, you could say, I did, and then you start talking about, oh, yeah, I remember this time we went to the lake, we all just got plowed up drunk, and we, stole a boat, went around, and you could do that kind of thing. Or you could say this. You could decide not to answer, but if you say, I'm not going to answer that question, you've answered the question. So another approach is to answer the question at least partly. Yeah, I did some things in high school. I did some drinking. I did occasionally experiment with drugs. In retrospect, I really wish I hadn't. But here's the main tip. Do not let that become the focus of the conversation. That's the game. Let's get mom and dad talking about their use, and then they're able to say to you, where do you get off telling me what I can do since you did it when you were in high school? And you get the answer, I get off by doing it by being bigger and smarter, and you're a parent, and I've got more power and more energy and more insurance, and and I've got the power to make your life miserable if you play around with that stuff, and if you do play around with it, I will exercise that right. And you do it by being an authority, by being kind and clear and supportive, but that your history just is not what's at issue here. I've made all kinds of mistakes in my life that I hope my kids will avoid. So the main trick on that is just don't get caught up. Don't get caught into that trap of once you've made the confession, you've lost your moral authority, because you haven't. By the same token, if it's true, you never played around with anything, you never drank in high school, and you never did drugs, then your kids are going to say, hey, you don't get to tell me anything because you never tried it. So you can't win. So you just don't let that become the focus of the conversation. So let's just kind of end with a few last things. What can we do? First step we've already taken. You're here. You're here in large numbers, and we've got to educate ourselves. And so as the year goes on and the years passes, I hope we continue to have programs to learn about different aspects of these difficulties. You have to know the facts, and I frankly think it's particularly important to avoid scare tactics. It's a bad idea to exaggerate the truth. You don't have to. The truth is bad enough, right? If you say to your kids, if you smoke a joint, you're going to have children with terrible deformities. Your kid will find out in 5 minutes on Google that you're lying to them. So we have a responsibility to learn the truth. The truth is bad enough. You don't have to make up things that are worse than they really are. So that's an approach to consider. Talk about it often. Talk about it early. Look for those natural opportunities to bring it up, which are in abundance in our culture. Again, just last week we had an example. I do believe the safest approach is a no-use approach. And I know that's particularly when it comes to alcohol, a fairly radical idea, although frankly, I don't know how it became such a radical idea, but it did at some point. We have to consider what it is that we are modeling, and that's a big challenge to us, is to pay attention to our own behavior and think about what is the message that I'm communicating with my own use. And that thing of, I'm an adult and you're a child, can be valid, but it only goes so far. If kids grow up in an environment where alcohol is de rigueur in anything social, then what else are they going to have except that attitude as soon as they're able to drink? People have alcohol when they have fun and when they get together, and when that's what's taught in schools, how can they avoid feeling that way? Years ago, there was a public service announcement that ran on TV, like in the early 70s or late 60s, that was, it's 10 o'clock and you know where your kids are. This has become, this is still a pretty good idea, all right? The whole thing about accountability, which has become more difficult in some ways and easier in other ways because of cell phones. All right, so the cell phone thing is, as long as they can reach me, and as long as I can reach them by cell phone, then that gives us some level of comfort with parents as we get really loose by curfews. As long as I can call them, they can call me, let me know if they're in trouble, then we start feeling more confident or more comfortable than being out at crazy hours, and I think that's not good. Another approach we could take is to remind ourselves that we have no legal or moral obligation to provide our children an iPhone, believe it or not. We really don't. And if we do, and if we're paying the bills, part of that sort of contract, maybe even literally a contract, I've got one for you if you want one, could be that you have to have GPS activated and you have to friend me on Find My Friends, and I want to be able to know where you are. Don't use the iPhone as a form of trickery to get away with all kinds of things. So it's been really kind of a double-edged sword, the whole cell phone thing for us. We have to help our teens discover and develop strategies for getting out of high-pressure situations. I'm going to end with a quick story. I think I'm almost done. Quick story. People, for some reason, love this story, but when one of my daughters probably was about 15, and she wanted to come to a party and go to a party in Mountain Brook. And as I said, we live in Vestavia Hills. I was not feeling great about it, but I was kind of having that attitude of, oh, you know, she's getting older. Why do I have to be Dr. Danger all the time? Maybe I need to relax a little bit. So I drive her to the party, and as soon as I drive up to this house in Mountain Brook, birthday party, I'm not happy. The front yard is dark. There's, you know, about as many people there on the front yard as are here tonight. In the dark, there's a band playing. Everybody's got red Solo cups happening. I'm not liking this. So what I probably should have done is just driven off, but about the time I was going to drive off, all of my daughter's friends converged on the car and greeted my daughter while she's still in the car. I thought, well, I'm about to humiliate her by driving away. So instead, I kind of turned to her, and I did about 3 years of lectures in about 3 seconds, you know. Don't do that, but I do that. She's like, oh, okay, right. So she gets out of the car, and she goes into the party, and to this day, she doesn't know this. I just went to her graduation with her master's degree last week. She still doesn't know this. I never got more than a block and a half away. Went down the block, turned right, pulled over to the curb. I keep a book in my car, so I'm just there in the neighborhood. And about 15 minutes later, she calls me on my cell phone, and she says, Dad, I'm so sorry. I know you're already home. You know, I wouldn't. It's just a half a block. She said, I've got a migraine, so could you come get me? I said, sure. So, and then she said, could you get me like a half a block down the road? So I said, sure. So I go the half block down the road. She gets in the car, and we go home, and I don't ask her any questions, and she doesn't offer anything. My daughter doesn't have migraines. I have a migraine was code language in the Wisely family for I'm in a situation which is kind of hinky, and I don't want to get embarrassed. Could you get me out of this? So we had prearranged that. And so those kind of strategies, when you think about it, asking a teenager to walk away from a social thing where something they're not quite comfortable with is happening is a tall order. It's a lot to ask. So you have to help them with that by developing some kind of strategy to help them get out of those kind of situations. Last couple things. Don't sanction, don't allow passively or actively any kind of illegal activity, underage drinking, gatherings at your house, provide adequate supervision. Big problem in Mountain Brook, where sometimes the party's going over in the second floor of the east wing and the parents are sleeping in the west wing. But it's something we need to provide more supervision than we typically do. Let's go back to curfews. They make sense. They're safe. They contribute to good behavior, and don't be willing to negotiate too much just because somebody has a cell phone. Let's be clear about our expectations, and then let's network with each other. It requires a lot of moral courage. So when your daughter says, I'm going over to Renee's house, we're going to spend the night, and there's going to be a couple other people there, and yes, the parent's going to be there, what do? We call those parents. And when you say to your young person, I have to call Mrs. So-and-so to find out that's true, and just kind of watch the color drain from her face, then you know you're on to something. We need to network. We need to put our kids in a situation where they can no longer say, Mrs. Jones allows this, or Dr. Jones allows this, or so-and-so. And again, even if we believe other parents are being more lenient than we are, our position needs to be, we just don't care. So join me in this last chant about not caring what other people do. We just don't care. Come on. We just don't care. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and God bless.
Obviously, I'm not Rick. I'm Suzanne. Thank y'all all for coming out tonight. I know it's been a long evening. You've been up since the crack of dawn getting your kids to work and school them to school and you to work. But if you'll just hang on, we just have a few more minutes to share about Trip. Mr. Howard read my mind in thinking that I want to erase that stereotypical image you have of an alcoholic, of a drug addict, of a drug user. Because as you saw with Brad, wasn't he an all-American, awesome-looking boy? That's not what you have in your mind. That's not what you think. So even Tripp's friends, when they found out we were going to talk about him tonight, they said, please don't let those folks think he was an addict. Tell him what he really was. So even young people don't see that. They have in their minds the same stereotypical image that we do. So Rick was asked to speak, and I horned in on it. No, actually, he was kind enough to let me talk about Trip too, because I love to. But my mind began racing, thinking, how in the world can I let those people know what a fine, amazing, wonderful, kind boy he was? I thought immediately, I'll gather all his accomplishments, his awards, the poems he wrote, the songs, the short stories. I can get all the anecdotes that his teachers and friends told me about him, what a great person he was. I could get the Crimson and White wrote an awesome obituary that really captured his personality. I'll bring that. And I'll bring the book that his friends published of all his writings to give money to charity, sold for money for charity. I'll bring all that. And then I realized, am I preparing for show and tell? Is this just a sales presentation? You see, that's what happens when your child dies as a result of something that society deems as shameful. You just want to do anything you can to negate that mental image in their head. You want to just shout, but he was a good, kind boy. Because he was. But thank you for letting us share about Trip. He was a good boy, and I'm so proud of him.
Trip had a wonderful core group of friends that had a really unique bond. Johnny Hicks is back there. Trey Lewis is going to sing here in just a minute when I get finished with what I've got to say. And Suzanne, I appreciate them being here and trying to help us introduce Trip to y'all. I want to thank Charlotte Shaw and Leadership Vestavia and for everybody who's been involved in this program. Charlie asked me a couple of months ago if I would speak. It's amazing how quickly August the 18th got here. I started thinking, I thought, I need to write down some notes about what I want to talk about, and I started doing that Saturday morning, and very quickly I wrote down 22 pages of notes about Tripp. Y'all are probably thinking, for crying out loud, you mean we're going to have to go through this guy reading 22 pages? I'm going to try and be quick, because I know if Tripp were here, he would say, come on, Dad, you can't take that long. Tripp was an incredible blessing for Suzanne and I for 22 years. As most of you know, he grew up here in Vestavia, went to Vestavia West, went to Bazitz Middle and graduated from the high school in 2006. From there, he went to school in Tuscaloosa and was awarded a posthumous degree from the University of Alabama in 2011. Tripp loved to write. Suzanne just mentioned that just a minute ago. He was never without a pad in his pocket. He loved to write songs, but he also wrote short stories and poems. And at the time of his death, he was being, one of his short stories had been submitted to the university for the best short story at the University of Alabama. He played music and played in bands since he was in middle school. His musical tastes were not my particular musical taste, but he was incredibly passionate about his music. And you're going to hear it in just a minute when we get the video going. There was a song selected, Jukebox, on my grave, and nobody would have liked a jukebox on their grave rather than the headstone that we got for Tripp. He was an amazing person who impacted so many people's lives for good. Tripp was also an alcoholic, and he was someone who struggled with drug addiction. And because of the way that he died, Suzanne and I felt compelled tonight to talk to you about our story. And I want to do that through what I consider mental images or snapshots that are in my mind about the course of his life and the time that we have spent reflecting on his life over the past 3 years. And I can't do that without talking to you about the first snapshot that comes to my mind, and it's a law and order kind of snapshot. You're probably thinking, what in the world is that? For just a few minutes, I want to talk to you about February 25th, 2011. It's the day Tripp died. Suzanne and I had been helping with her brother, Wally, who for 17 months had been battling brain cancer. I was on my way to Baldwin County for trial, and Suzanne called me right about the Georgiana exit and said, Rick, hospice is called. Wally's not going to make it through the night. You need to come home. And so I did. I got everything continued, and I headed back. Suzanne and I hurried over to her brother's house so we could be with the family and plan his memorial service. We stayed there until about 11 o'clock that night. And Suzanne and I both realized, along with the family, that Wally wasn't going anywhere. And I said, you know something, Suzanne, I got to go home. Because I'd been at it since about 6 o'clock that morning, so we headed to the house, and we got in bed at maybe 11:30 that night. And I remember passing out. I don't even remember taking my shoes off. But we hit the bed, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, we get a phone call. Now, over the course of Tripp's years, I'd had several phone calls in the middle of the night, so that wasn't surprising to me, but we got a phone call, and I answered the phone, and I couldn't understand what the guy was saying. And so I thought, well, maybe I'm going to just assume that this is a prank call. And so I turned the phone off, put it down. About 5 seconds later, it rang again, and I looked, it was the same number. I told Suzanne, I said, hey, this one's yours. You're going to have to deal with this one. I knew that something wasn't right. When she sat up in the bed and she turned on the light, and someone had called and said that Tripp was having problems and that they had taken him to UAB. Suzanne and I were confused because Tripp lived in Tuscaloosa. He was in school in Tuscaloosa about 10 hours from graduating. And I thought, what in the world's he doing in Birmingham? Well, we find out later that he was playing music. And whoever called said, I tell you what, they think, because I asked Suzanne, I said, find out what's going on. Is he going to be okay? And they said, yeah, he's going to be okay. And so we took off, got our clothes on. I do remember saying to Suzanne, I said, do you think, regardless of the circumstances, that you're going to be able to handle this? Because I knew that Tripp struggled with a lot of different problems. And she said, yeah, I can do it. I think I can do it. So we got in the car, and we both thought we could do it. We headed down 65. And I'll never forget, do what? My wife's motioned for me. I'm going to have to stay. I'm used to talking to people in the jury box, and I like to pound up and down in front of them like a preacher. But I'll stay behind this box so y'all can hear. I'm good. Thank you. So we got in the car. We're taking off down I-65, and Suzanne said, Rick, what in the world are you doing? And I said, what do you mean, what am I doing? I'm driving to the hospital. And she said, you're going 20 miles an hour. And I thought, are you serious? I looked at the speedometer, and sure enough, I was traveling 20 miles an hour, and I thought to myself, she can't wait to get there, and I don't want to get there. I remember when we got to the hospital, and there was some guy at the ER desk, and I tell you what, I can be difficult from time to time. And we got there, and I said, where's my son? And he said, I don't know who your son is. I said, here, this is his name, and I want you to take me to him. And I remember he said, look, we're going to get somebody to take you to this room over here. And I thought, what kind of room over there? I can go sit with everybody else. And they said, no, we'll take you to this room. I remember thinking, this doesn't really sound very good. And Suzanne and I went in a private room by ourselves, and I wasn't sure at that point what was coming. But I was certain that I wasn't in a room that I wanted to be. You see, for years, Suzanne's watched Law and Order. I don't watch Law and Order. But if she's sitting there, laying there watching that, I'm looking at something else. And every time Law and Order, they have one of those scenes where the parents are hovered over a dead child, I seem to want to put down what I'm looking at and take a look at that. It's kind of like watching a crash at Talladega, or a plane crash, or something bad. I remember thinking, you know, what in the world would I do in that situation if I was like those people? Never good. I didn't realize at the time, but I was about to get my chance because we were in our little room, our private room by ourselves. And the first person that we saw was the hospital chaplain. Let me promise you something. It's never good when you get put in the private room and the hospital chaplain walks in the door. And she was followed by 3 doctors, an EMT, and detectives from the Birmingham Police Department. I don't know about y'all, but there are certain moments in my life that I have very vivid recollections of what's going on. I remember very clearly the birth of my children. I remember exactly where I was and what I was listening to when Paul Bryant died. I remember very clearly they came in, and the only words I heard was, we're sorry. We did everything we could. And my initial reaction was, no, they're not talking about Tripp. Somebody said that he was going to be okay. They got this completely wrong. And I sat numb, and I was in complete disbelief. I never knew what shock was until I knew what that moment was. And I sat there staring. And before they could leave the room, I remember Suzanne saying, I've got to see him. And that's why I call this my Law and Order moment, because I remember very vividly walking down a hospital aisle, had green tile, never forget that, toward what seemed like the largest room I'd ever seen. I don't know if the room was all that big, but I do know when we got there, the only thing that I saw in the middle of it was a metal table. And on that metal table was a body with a sheet. And I thought, I wonder if that's him. And I saw his curly hair. Only way I could identify him from where we were, and we kept on walking, and we got over to the side of that metal table, and he was laying there with a tube coming out of his mouth. He wasn't breathing. I checked. Wasn't doing anything. He was dead. And I'll never forget what Suzanne did, because I just stood there and stared. You know, when Tripp was a baby, what Suzanne would do when he was little, it didn't matter how cold it was. If he was covered up, what she liked to do is to uncover him and look at his hands and look at his feet. The snapshot, the mental image that I have of February 25th, 2011, the very last time I had an opportunity to see my son, was my wife pulling the covers back, pulling the sheet back, one last time, to look at his hands and what he'd grown to size 15 feet, one last time. And that's an image I'm certain that I'm going to carry with me as long as I'm living. Y'all are probably thinking, you know, for crying out loud, we didn't wait to hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes to end with some kind of miserable story like that. Why would you come and tell me such a horrible story? I'm convinced the greatest way that I can honor my son is for you to learn from mine and Suzanne's story. Because I know there are probably other people in this room that have similar stories. But for those of you who don't, I don't want anybody to have those kind of memories. You know, somebody asked me not too long ago, what's it like to lose a child to a drug overdose? I had never lost one to anything other than that, so I really can't comment on that, but I know what it's like to lose a child. And I can tell you that nothing is ever, ever quite the same. It's been 3.5 years since Tripp passed. And I kept wanting there to be a new normal. Everybody said, well, you know, it'll get normal again. It'll just be a new normal. My experience is there is no new normal. Every aspect of my life has a memory of Tripp. If I go to the grocery store, he was the thirstiest kid you ever saw. Every time I go down the drink aisle, I think about him. Every time I pass this ballpark coming home, I think about him. Every time I go to a ball game in Tuscaloosa, I think about him. Suzanne and I went to San Diego recently. We thought, you know, this would be a good time to get away. And we got to San Diego and thought that was really where we wanted to be. And we'd been there with Tripp not too long before that. And we decided we really didn't want to be there because of the memories that we had of the time that we spent with him there. I remember when I was at work, and I work on the 18th floor of a building downtown, I could see the interstate, and when I got back to work, I remember sitting at my desk looking at the interstate and watching cars go by, and I thought to myself, do they not understand what's happened in my world? Don't these people have any idea? One of the things I find myself doing, I watch and I read everything that I can find over and over. I stalk his Facebook page. His friends are afraid of me. Trying to stay connected in some way. You know, people say when you lose your parents, you lose your past, and when you lose your children, you lose your future. You know, I'm not so concerned about my future. But I can't tell you that I don't have some degree of anger every day over the fact that Tripp did not get his future. He never got married. He never had children. He never had the opportunity to reach his dreams and goals for his life. And I've had that opportunity, and I wanted him to have it as well. I gladly would have traded places with him. And the real truth of it is I'm not whole anymore. I'm not going to tell you that I am. And when Tripp died, a part of me died as well. People ask me what it's like to lose your child. That, for me, that's what it's like to lose your child. Snapshot number 2 that I keep thinking about, call it searching for clues. I've got so many mental images of the time at the ballpark, trips that we took. Tripp was so comfortable to be around. He was perfect for me. And we spent a lot of time together. So a really big question for me was, what in the world did I do wrong? Something was wrong. You see, in my mind, prior to Tripp's death, overdose only happened to kids from troubled backgrounds, the wrong side of town. Tripp grew up involved in multiple activities. He played ball, he played baseball and wrestled and football at the park and at school. We took him to church regularly. We were involved in every aspect of his life, every one. Suzanne and I had a great marriage. If I had to go back 31 years again, I'd never pick somebody else. I mean, if I got to have a wife that I got to walk through losing a child with, I can't imagine being married to anybody else. Suzanne and I had a great marriage. Tripp had no family drama to deal with. He had grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins that loved him. They spent time with him. They were involved with him. So what was it? Suzanne and I were living at the Homewood Suites, and that's another tale of misery that I won't bore you with. But our house flooded, and so we were there. And one day she brought in the mail. I'll never forget. And it's this yellow envelope right here from the Jefferson County Coroner Medical Examiner's Office. It was Tripp's autopsy. I can't tell you how long this laid in our Homewood Suites room without ever opening it. And I'd come in at night and I'd stare at the envelope until one night I thought, I can't believe I'm scared of that thing. I'm going to open that up. Surely that's got some clues. And I did. I have read every word of this autopsy report 10 million times. Cause of death, morphine abuse. You see, that's the way heroin breaks down. Manner of death, accident, contributory cause, ethanol abuse. Nobody ought to have to read their own child's autopsy, I'll tell you that. 10 pages of what his organs weighed. But I didn't find any answers. I got this nifty little bag here from the Jefferson County Coroner's Office. It's got his billfold. The money that he had $2 in his billfold. Had an ATM receipt where he checked out $20 to buy a hit of heroin. 2 hours before he died. 5 quarters, 3 dimes, 2 pennies, a Roy Orbison keychain that I stole. I've examined every single thing in this bag hundreds of times, looking for answers and looking for clues. There's no clues in either the autopsy report. There's no clues in that bag. I questioned every decision that I made as a parent. I looked for clues everywhere. I looked for someone to blame. But don't think I hadn't tried to blame this on somebody else, because I have. More than 1/2 of overdoses occur in the presence of other people, and Tripp was with at least 4 other people when he died. And when they realized he was in trouble, they hit the door. They left him there to die. So I wanted to blame them. You know, one of the points that you need to talk to your kids about is when drugs are involved and the police are on the way, you're not going to have any friends. So I wanted to blame them. More than anything else, I blame myself, and I can't constantly come back to why. You know, I think, did I work too much? Because I did. Did I ignore all the obvious signs, and how in the world could I have been so stupid? I read that every 14 minutes another family begins the process of enduring the pain of an overdose death. You know, one of Tripp's friends was cutting my hair recently, and I questioned her about drug use and when it started with Tripp. And she said it started with everybody early. The prevalence of drugs and alcohol was amazing to me at an early age in Vestavia. Always available, always accessible at parties. And I was shocked to learn that our kids are living in a different world than I lived in. I've seen the news recently where there are 2 houses that have been raided within a rock's throw of the high school where people are selling drugs. There are no barriers to drugs. They cross every social and economic boundary. I can tell you this, heroin is an equal opportunity substance because it crosses all lines. What conclusion did I come to after all my searching for clues? Because I've been searching and searching and searching. Here's the conclusion that I came to. It can look like everything is all right when in reality everything is all wrong. Snapshot 3. I'll never forget the last real conversation that I had with my son. He had come home over the weekend from Tuscaloosa, and we split a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning before he died. He came home from the weekend to help clean out a storage shed, and I could tell he was troubled. He was on the couch in the sunroom, and I thought, you know what better way for me to get him to open up, and this is a tip, I guess, than to go to Krispy Kreme and get a box of hot donuts to talk to your son. That's a joke. I don't really mean that. And I remember saying, Tripp, look, if you need some help, come home and I'll get you the help you need. And he never, ever, ever acknowledged that there was a problem. And he headed back to Tuscaloosa for the final week of his life. Which brings me to this point. If you have an opportunity to help your child, do it. I knew he needed help, and I didn't do it. Do whatever you got to do. Get them out of school. Get them away from their friends. Leave town if you have to. You know, one of the points that I think that has to be made is Tripp was so ashamed of his drug use. He didn't want us to know. He didn't want his friends to know. He didn't want anybody to know. And his friends that are here tonight will tell you that when he was using, he left. He wanted to do it by himself. He did everything he could to hide it. I look on the autopsy report. Because I looked. I don't know a whole lot about heroin. But I do remember looking at his body thinking, I wonder if he's shooting anything, injecting anything. And the heroin, apparently you can inject a lot of different ways. When I look at the autopsy report, one of the things that stood out to me is that he was shooting it between his toes. He was shooting it in his lower extremities so nobody would know. And so nothing was said, and he struggled in absolute silence. I never recognized the extent of the problem because Tripp was functional. He went to class. He was doing well in his classes, making decent grades. So he was ashamed, and I think deep down, and I'm ashamed to say this, but I think deep down I was ashamed too. It was so hard for me with his drugs and his alcohol because I always wanted to fix things for my kids when they messed up, and this was something I couldn't fix. He always said it wasn't true. He trained me to leave him alone about it. Your kids will do that. They'll train you. And he did. He trained me well. And so I left him alone. And he gave me all the information that he wanted me to have. And I accepted it. You know, the University of Alabama has a nice memorial to students who passed away over the past year. and Suzanne and I attended, and I didn't know any of the other kids who passed. But for some strange reason, I came back from that memorial and I started looking them up. And I found out that at least 6 of the 12 people that they honored at that memorial had died from alcohol and drugs. I started looking at their obituaries. And they said the exact same thing that Tripp's did, and that is they either died or they died suddenly. You see, I wrote the words for Tripp's obituary. And if you look at it, it said Tripp Norris died suddenly. These other students did as well. They either died or they died suddenly. I look back up Suzanne's brother who died a week after Tripp with brain cancer. Said Wally Barker died after a 17-month struggle, a long and courageous struggle with cancer. Nobody could have fought it any harder than Wally did. I'll agree with that. But I've had time to think about that, and now I wonder why. When I wrote my son's obituary, why in the world did I not put, my son died after a long and courageous battle with alcohol and drug addiction? If Wally Barker were here, if Suzanne's brother were here, and he could walk on this stage, I can promise you this. He would gladly tell you that his struggle was no more long and it was no more courageous than my son's. You see, my perception of a drug user before Tripp passed was someone who lived on the fringes that nobody cared about. When I thought of a drug addict, I had in my mind some wide-eyed, crazy person that lived in filth somewhere else. And man, if you talk to me, I could provide wonderful moralizing commentary about self-destructive behavior, and don't think Tripp didn't hear it from me. It's amazing how it took the death of my son to change my whole perspective about addiction. In all honesty with you, I continue to be conflicted about addiction. But one of the things I'm really, really clear on that I would have never said before Tripp passed, I'm confident that addiction is a disease, and it brings about prejudices about what is socially acceptable. I think science is clear. Addiction is not a moral choice. I'm convinced that addiction is no choice at all. Don't get me wrong. It's voluntary the first few times. There's no question about that. But there's people who take drugs, 10% of, I've read, that continue to use. They can't help it. It opens up a Pandora's box that they're never able to close. I've never been addicted to drugs or alcohol, so I don't have any idea what that's like. But you know something? I've been addicted to donuts and candy and cake. Hopeful periods of dieting followed by devastating trips to the scale when I went on a candy binge. I mean, we all have some experiences, don't we, where we fail to live up to the skinny, sober ideas of our society. People with addictions are no worse than the rest of us, and their passing leaves no less of a hole. I didn't have my first dozen donuts because I wanted to be a fatso. And I'm certain that Tripp didn't have his first hit of heroin because he wanted to be an addict. He was in an age where he thought he was invincible. Kids don't think anything bad's going to happen. He lived his life with no fear. And that's the way he died. But he was so ashamed of his addictions. He was an incredibly bright, gifted, extraordinary person who died drunk while shooting heroin, and that's so hard for me to accept. He struggled in silence and died doing something that he was so ashamed of. No one likes to talk about drugs. No one likes to talk about addiction. But we can't ignore it anymore. And where does that leave us? For me, I think Vestavia as a community has got to create an environment in which our young people no longer feel ashamed to talk about addiction and how it's affecting those and the ones they love. Nobody was better at playing the blame game than I was before Tripp passed. We've got to lay off the blame game. It's time to start talking about it. And I think this is so important. It's not a discussion that you as parents need to have. It's a discussion that you have got to have with your children. You've got to. I can tell you, apparently for me, it was easier to be in denial of myself and other people. But we've got to be honest, because drugs have robbed this city of too many of its best and brightest. It's a disease from which no one is immune. Regardless of where you live, your upbringing, the most horrible nature of the drug to me is that it robs you of your dignity. And we've got to find a way to make it a disease that carries a little more dignity than it does. We just got to. You're probably sitting there thinking, will this guy ever shut up and tell us how to stop it? I mean, what's the answers? Come on. So you waited this long. I'm going to tell you what the answer is. I don't have a doggone clue. I have no idea. But I know this, you can't love a kid anymore, Suzanne, and I love that one. So love can't stop heroin. Love can't stop overdoses. What will? I wrote down 4 things. Awareness. We've got to create an awareness in this community that drugs are a real problem here, because nobody could ever convince me of that before Tripp died. I would have never believed it. Through meetings just like this, the discussion has begun. You've got to keep it going. Don't look away. Use me as the example that looked away and ignored the apparent problems of my son. Second thing, we've got to change our perspective on addiction. You're never going to hear me stand up and say, you know, we need to glorify addiction. We need to glorify drug use. No way. But it can't continue to carry the same stigma and shame, or we're going to continue to lose kids who are continuing to struggle in silence. We got to create an atmosphere where you can have a discussion. And you see, I didn't do that. Even the last time that I shared donuts with Tripp, I don't share donuts with a whole lot of people. Suzanne can tell you that. I don't share my desserts. But he knew where I stood on drugs. And he knew it was a closed conversation. And so he was never willing to talk to me about it. You've got to create an atmosphere where you can have a discussion with your kids. It took his dying to change my perspective. Don't let that happen to you. Last thing I'd say is you've got to change the rules. Most likely the friends are not going to tell you, and I'm old. But I'm not too old to remember that there's a code of silence among friends. I never would have told on my buddies. We got to create new rules. I mean, young people may think, well, you know something, I'll lose my friend if I tell. You got to get them to change the rules, because they may lose them for good if they don't. We got to break the rules. You know, Suzanne and I had an opportunity to talk with a number of Tripp's friends in preparation for this meeting, and every one of them, every single one of them, said, don't you dare focus on the way that he died. I hope I hadn't done that. Because for Suzanne and I, his life is never going to be defined by addiction and overdose. Tripp was an amazing person and son who was loved so powerfully by his friends. And we'll always keep him alive by continuing to talk. And we'll always grieve. I kind of sound like Jimmy Valvano here, but I can tell you, heroin took Tripp's life. But it's not ever going to take his memories. It's never going to take his character. And I'm not ever going to let it take his dignity. You know, I wouldn't be doing this community right and the people in this room right if I didn't say thank you. We had a memorial service for Tripp, and it was incredibly attended by the people of this community. This is a community that loves its children. That's obvious to me, and it continues to be obvious to Suzanne and I, and that's why we'll always call this our home. You know, Tripp loved music. I can't think of a better way to finish than to have Trey Lewis come. Trey is a Vestavia boy who was a wonderful friend of Tripp's. And Suzanne and I are so proud of Trey. Trey is playing music at a lot of different places now, and he has a new album out. Trey struggled with all of the issues that we've talked about tonight, and he is 7 years sober. But Trey's here tonight to sing a song after this little short video, and it's about overcoming addiction. And the name of the song is The Man That I've Become. He's Trey Lewis. Suzanne and I can't tell you how much we appreciate y'all being here. And thank y'all so much for listening.
What do you know, I'm living right. Took a while and some sleepless nights, but I finally turned myself to the light, and I'm really moving on. People say I cleaned up good, now I'm doing better than I know I should. I should be dead in all likelihood, but instead I'm writing you to say how much I know I truly let you down. And I know I never was a real good man like you have now. And I'm so sorry for the wreckage and damage that I've done. See, I never knew I was just 12 steps away from the man that I've become. I let go in steps 1 and 2. 3, I prayed God would get me through. Man, 4 and 5 were so hard to do, but the good Lord knows I did it. Step 6 changed how I looked at things, and I finished 7 in early spring. Hey, made a list of people I'd done wrong, so tonight I'm writing you to say how much I know I truly let you down. And I know I never was a real good man like you have now. And I'm so sorry for the wreckage and damage that I've done. See, I never knew I was just 12 steps away from the man that I've become. I'm learning more and more each and every day. And one day they say that I can give it all away, but until then, I'm writing you to say how much I know I truly let you down. And I know I never was a real good man like you have now. And I'm so sorry for the wreckage and damage that I've done. See, I never knew I was just 12 steps away from the man that I've become. Thank you for letting me be a part of this.